One thing I was going to say about going back to Splatterpunk, even at the time when it started to take off and everybody was suddenly claiming that that's what they wanted to write and that's what they do, and and there's a lot of writers, like you brought up the gore for gore's sake. There's the Ed Lee crowd, and now they call that Siction, I think.
They call it what?
Siction.
Fiction.
Siction.
Fiction.
Sick.
Oh, Siction.
But
Cool.
what I told them then, and especially about you guys and Clive in particular, is that first off, I didn't see it as as big a difference as everybody else seemed to. The writing was better, and what people didn't seem to understand was there were a lot of people writing bad horror novels in the 80s. There were a lot of people writing okay horror novels in the 80s.
Well, I remember.
But you guys could really write, and that was a difference for me. And
Thank you.
Clive could really write.
Yeah, I'd like to think that makes a difference.
But it didn't always. I mean, back in those, I've got piles and mountains of paperback books. To
well,
prove otherwise.
I remember when horror. We kind of came out of this. There was this. Splatterpunk wasn't a movement. It's not like we got together with a secret handshake and decided to launch something. It was a spontaneous occurrence in the culture at a given point in time.
Yes, but everybody that saw you guys was still trying to figure out the handshake because they wanted in.
Because they wanted into the club. Well, and the funny thing is, there was, and then there became the whole loud versus quiet debate. And the old guard, the guys who were the Turks, who had worked so hard for so long, and they're finally like at a point where it's like, and now it's our turn, and all of a sudden, who are these pricks? Who just like kind of kicked in the door, crashed the party, wearing black leather jackets and are making a lot of noise, and all of a sudden the crowd's looking at them. And, it's like, well, we couldn't help that. I mean, it's like, it's like Splatterpunk was not like, and I went out and bought a black leather jacket so I could be one. I mean, that's just who the fuck we were. It's like, do I look like a guy who's supposed to spend his life working in a cubicle? This is who we were, this is who we are. Even 25 years, 30 years later, just still who I am. I'm a natural born troublemaker.
It just made me smile because they tried, and I think it might have been part of what you're saying, that they were trying to pigeonhole you guys as the guys who went too far or crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. But at the same time, Stephen King's got Pet Sematary coming out, turning a little boy into road pizza.
Sure.
There was no difference. He's a good writer. He wrote what needed to be written.
Yeah. Well,
that's what happened in the story. How else do you write that?
During the boom of the big boom of horror fiction and literature in the mid-1980s, it reached such an intensity. And Splatterpunk helped engender some of that intensity. I mean, certainly the success of writers like Stephen King, and then Stephen, I was there at the convention when Stephen actually kind of gave the benediction to Clive Barker. That was my first convention, and he was talking about
the new face of horror.
Steve was up in front of an entire room full of people, and he was talking about this writer that nobody had ever heard of, and the story that he had written called "In the Hills, the Cities," and Steve looks out and realizes he's just looking at all these blank faces like, what the fuck are you talking about? He's like, Stephen King actually, like, he's standing up there. He's like, you've never read this guy? It's like, this guy makes us look like we've been asleep for the last 30 years. And he's inclusive of himself. And then the next day, I think it was at the banquet or something like that, Steve got up and said, I have seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker. And then Clive, and it was I was 24 years old, and brand new to all of this. I mean, I had no plans on being a writer, but when Bantam bought The Light at the End and then wanted more books from us.
Plans changed.
Well, it beats being a street messenger. And, John and I talked about it. It's like, well, do you want to run with this more? And it's like, well, yeah, why not? And so step through that door and destiny changes. But I'm, even at that tender age and not really, I didn't grow up with the writer's ego, of I always wanted this. I just thought, this is fucking cool. And it's like, but, I play music, I play rock and roll, I do art, it's like medium changes. It's all about storytelling to me. But I'm there when Stephen King says that about Clive Barker, and I just, I saw it come out of his mouth, and I just looked across the room, and I saw 100 light bulbs go off over 100 heads. You know, and this is all like serious, like editors and publishers, and the next thing you know, horror is booming.
Yes.
And Clive goes from being extremely talented, fairly obscure English writer to a superstar. You know, on the basis of his talent, you know, with a very helpful leg up from Steve. But then horror became a boom period for a while. And I remember talking to an editor who I like very much at a publishing house, and, you know, every publisher in New York was trying to jump on the horror bandwagon. And this one editor said, we're planning on doing, what was it? It's like, we're going to do 4 horror novels a month.
And they did.
That's our commitment. You know, and I'm like, 4 times 12 a month? And I'm like, are there that many good horror novels in a year?
Well, you know, another thing that I've noticed in bringing back a lot of these old titles from that period, because that's a lot of what Crossroad Press has done, is brought back horror novels from that period. You go back and you read the reader reviews over like a 15-year period. Mm-hmm. Astounding number of reviews that say, not really sure why this was marketed as a horror novel.
Well, yeah.
A lot of writers like Melanie Tim and Clive Barker, who I've talked to about this, and he says, well, I've never really considered myself a horror writer. I never thought about being a horror writer. I was a fantasist.
Yeah, and horror didn't used to be... there didn't used to be a section in bookstores called horror.
I wish there had never been.
It used to be in fiction.
Yeah.
You know, and the horror, you know, and partly, you know, nobody's really to blame for this, but, you know, I saw some of this at the time, and I was really kind of sad to see it happening. It's like horror as a genre raced to acquire in a period of about 5 years what it took science fiction like 50 years to build, a ghetto of their own.
Yep.
You know, and to me it's like, you know, it's like, here, put it on, put the star on, and you can live in this neighborhood. You know, it's like, I don't want that on. You know, it's like, I don't mind being called a horror writer, but what I do mind is people building a fence around me and telling me what I can and can't do.
Too much like a modular house. It fell apart in a few years, and
and
nowhere
you
else
know,
to go.
My innate reaction to people trying to box me in has always been to kick down whatever walls they're putting up around me, and it's like, you know, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. You know, a lot of what I do tends to be, I've always been tuned to the darker frequencies. I like writing about, you know, scary and disturbing and dark and twisted subject matter, but that's just, it's part of my wiring. I mean, when I get, you know, people, where do you get your ideas? I'm like, reality. You know, it's like the time it takes me to write about, especially nowadays in the 21st century, good God, you know, the time it takes me to actually write a book, a novel, a screenplay, you know, by the time I have thought of the most sick, twisted, deranged, fucked up thing I can possibly, in my very vivid imagination, come up with, all I have to do is turn on like one of the 24/7 news cycles, and reality has already clocked me on it. You know, I mean, you can't even keep up with how twisted it is. But, you know, I said it a generation ago, I said it 25 years ago, you know, when we were doing Splatterpunk interviews, and it's more true today than ever. It's like, fear is a renewable resource. Last time I looked out the door, the world has not gotten any less scary. In fact, it's gotten more scary. If I woke up tomorrow and the world wasn't as scary and fucked up of a place as it was, I would be happily retired.
You could always go to a political convention if you ran out of ideas.
Yeah, I have. It's like, you know, but it's like, as long as the world continues to be the incredibly, you know, the paradoxically incredibly beautiful, incredibly terrifying, incredibly fucked up place that it is, I will always have a job to do. You know, and that's what I do.